Now, I said as we were going along that one of the issues that Luther faced was this issue of his own leadership and the issue of divergent interpretations that began to emerge. And I think this might be a place then to pause and look at the movement that comes to be known as Anabaptism. Anabaptism literally is derived from Greek, ana meaning the re-baptizers. Which obviously means that Anabaptist is a title put on the movement by its enemies. The defenders of what we call the Anabaptist point of view did not think they were re-baptizing anybody. They thought they were baptizing people who had never been baptized. But that label was important politically because in the Code of Justinian, which was still legal code in the 16th century, it declared anyone who rebaptized another person was subject to death. So to label these people Anabaptists was to place them immediately outside the law. Now, where did Anabaptism come from? Well, in part, of course, it came from people going back to reading the Bible. And the early Anabaptists said, look, we read the Bible. We've been warned by Luther and others against just holding to traditions that have no foundation in the Bible. I read the Bible, I don't find anything about infant baptism there. And so we should eliminate infant baptism. It's just a holdover from Roman Catholicism. That was part of the argument. It was an argument that began in Zurich in earnest with Conrad Grebel, who performed the first rebaptism that we have a solid record of in January 1525. And this really shook Zwingli, it shook the Christian establishment. It raised the whole question of, is Christianity just a movement of individuals that have committed themselves to Christ, or is Christianity also a movement of families and, by extension, of societies? If you can't have a Christian family, how can you have a Christian state? There was a lot at stake in this debate. And so Zwingli gave himself to study it, Luther did, later Calvin would, and they came to conclude that the exegesis of the Anabaptists was wrong, that the Bible did, in fact, in a variety of ways, teach infant baptism. For any of you who are doubters, I might just mention 1 Corinthians 10 says Moses and Israel passed through the Red Sea and they were all baptized in the Red Sea. Well, there were surely children that passed through the Red Sea and were baptized. Now, you may think that's sneaky, and it is kind of, but think about it. The problem is that this movement very early on got identified with violence. Now, today we think of the Anabaptists and we think of the Mennonites, we think of the Amish, we think of maybe Hutterites. The surviving Anabaptists are almost all pacifists. They all seem like very nice people. They seem like they're not troublemakers at all. They withdraw from society. Why would anybody get mad at these people? Why would anybody persecute these people? Why would anybody be furious with these people? We have to remember that was not the reputation of Anabaptists in the 16th century. The reputation began to be made by Thomas Müntzer and the Peasants' War, and then it was reinforced by events in the German city of Münster. Now, this is where students always get confused. The German city of Münster was a city that first had Lutheran preaching, and then after Lutheranism got fairly well established there, then some radicals from the Netherlands came to preach in Münster. And in due course, the whole city became sufficiently Anabaptist that they exiled everyone who resisted the Anabaptist movement. And there was first a leader named Jan Matthijs, and then John of Leyden made himself king of Münster. He introduced polygamy. He introduced all sorts of Old Testament laws. The whole thing sort of went crazy from a 16th century point of view. And many princes said, you know, this is a disaster. This is the establishment of exactly the wrong interpretation of the Bible. Here we have violence. Here we have the introduction of sub-Christian ethics. This is going from bad to worse, and eventually the city of Munster was besieged after a couple of years of this, and finally was captured, and King John of Leyden was executed. But it stamped in the public mind of the 16th century the idea that Anabaptists were dangerous, crazy, violent, seditious people. And although the majority of them, especially later in the century, were not, most of the leaders of the Reformation and most of the Roman Catholics never got over that impression. The Belgic Confession, which was written in 1561 and is one of the confessions of the Dutch Reformed churches, says at one point, "We detest the Anabaptists and other seditious persons." See, that's the maintenance of that notion, that belief about the Anabaptists. Now, Anabaptist as a title is not all that helpful a title. It's a little like the title Protestant. If you label somebody a Protestant, you know something about them, but you don't know everything. My next door neighbor is a very good friend, is a Roman Catholic, and we were out to dinner the other night, and he was grumbling about Pope Benedict XVI, and I finally said to him, you know, there's a technical term for Roman Catholics who don't like the Pope. He said, really, what's that? I said, it's Protestant. He didn't like that. So the label Protestant tells you something, but it doesn't tell you very much. In the next course of study, we'll look at Puritanism. The title Puritan tells you something, but you soon discover there's a huge amount of stuff under that label. It doesn't tell you all that much. And the same is true of Anabaptists. The label Anabaptist tells us that these were groups that rejected the tradition of a Christian society as it had developed in the Middle Ages, and either wanted to withdraw from that society into their own communities, the way the Amish would eventually do, or want to radically remake society the way the people at Munster did. So here you have this movement, but with quite different goals in different sections of the movement. They would not have thought of themselves as a movement. They would have thought of themselves as very separate groups. For some of them, the main issue did become rebaptism, or believer's baptism, as they would have said. And they wanted to say each person has to make his or her own personal commitment to Christ, and only after that personal commitment should someone be baptized. That's led some people to think, well, this is the origin of the modern Baptist movement. But actually, I don't think that's right. Even some Baptists will argue that the Anabaptists are the source of the modern Baptist movement. I don't think that's true. Because the Anabaptists frequently would go on and say, he is a Christian who is baptized as a believer and leads a life of righteousness. In other words, most of the Anabaptists were really not clear, which is kind of the kindest thing you can say, about the doctrine of justification as Luther and the later Protestant tradition would define it. There is a strong dose of legalism in Anabaptism, and a strong sense that all sorts of externals are necessary. Must women cover their heads in church? In relatively brief Anabaptist confessions, the most famous of which was written in 1527 by Michael Sattler and is known as the Schleitheim Confession because that's the city in which it was prepared. It deals with all sorts of how exactly we go about excommunicating people, what exactly is the nature of the ban in terms of talking or not talking to excommunicated people. There's lots of externals there, and when people like Luther or Calvin looked at that kind of teaching, they said, that's legalism. That's not an understanding of the gospel, and I think there was something correct about that judgment. That's led to lots of modern debates amongst historians. Is Anabaptism really an anticipation of the future? Is it one of the more modern religious movements? And people have argued that because they wanted free churches. They wanted churches independent of the government. They didn't want established churches. They wanted churches kind of like we have in America, that you sink or swim by whether people come to the church or not. The government doesn't step in to pay the ministers or build the church buildings. And so some people said, well, you see, the Anabaptists were ahead of the curve there. They were anticipating all of that. I think it is probably more correct to say the Anabaptists are better seen as a kind of revival of medieval sectarian spirit that wanted strictly disciplined Christian living. They're not really in anticipation of the future. They're not really thoroughly Protestant. They are more a medieval call for a stricter morality. They're almost a monastic kind of movement, rejecting the world around them in one way or another, separating themselves from the world. I think contemporary Anabaptists, like Mennonites and some Amish, have in fact moved towards a more genuinely Protestant point of view. But in the 16th century, I think they're probably not best seen as so much Protestant as a renewal of a kind of medieval form of spirituality. Now again, I'm generalizing. I'm committing the error I've criticized others for doing. I've lumped them all together. And some of them were really labored to just believe the Bible, like Menno Simons, although he had strange notions about the incarnation. But then there were there's a technical term, wacky. There were some wacky folk who thought they received revelations. And then there was a really dangerous part of the movement that are sometimes called the evangelical rationalists, really kind of anticipating Protestant liberalism. And in this group, you found the rise of anti-Trinitarianism. These folks said, well, if baptism is a Roman Catholic tradition, infant baptism is a Roman Catholic tradition we don't need to preserve and can dump, why isn't the Trinity just another Roman Catholic tradition that we can dump? I don't find the word Trinity in the Bible. And so there were these, thankfully only a relatively small number of them that never attracted a really wide following, but there were these folks, some of them very bright, who adopted an anti-Trinitarian point of view, the most famous of which, of course, was Michael Servetus, whom, if you haven't heard of, good for you, but we will return to talk briefly about him when we come to John Calvin.